Well, this is part 2 of the video segments pertaining to Chapter 40 of the Legal Environment of Business. We're talking about corporate directors, officers, and shareholders. In part 1 of the first video segment, we talked about officers and directors and the respective roles that they played in running and working for the corporation. And we saw that those duties were somewhat different because their roles were different. In this particular segment, we'll talk about the directors and the officers as well, and the duties that are involved in their respective positions. And we'll find that, at least with respect to this area, there is much more overlap regarding the duties and responsibilities, duties and liabilities of the directors and the officers. And a lot of this is going to look very familiar to you because we talked about these similar duties when we were talking about the duties of partners in partnerships and the duties of members of an LLC. That is to say, when it comes to duties, there's two primary duties, a duty of care and a duty of loyalty. Let's first talk about the duty of care. This is also described about, again, with regard to partners and members of LLCs, previously on page 709 of the text, but with regard to shareholders, with regard to directors and officers, it's talked about on page 766. Basically, the duty of care requires acting in good faith on behalf of the corporation, exercising care of an ordinary prudent person that would be in their situation, and do what they believe is in the best interests of the corporation. A duty of care and acting in good faith. That includes making informed decisions about that you make on behalf of the corporation, doing your homework, doing your research, and a duty to exercise a reasonable amount of supervision on the corporation as far as what goes on and the big policy decisions you're making. Not just be a guy that shows up, throws in their 2 cents and then disappears until the next board of directors meeting. And if you are a director that disagrees with what's going on as far as decisions that are being made in the corporation, you need to reflect that in the minutes of your meeting with the other directors, because if you don't, it will be assumed that you concur with the decisions that are being made. So you've got these kind of pretty tall responsibilities, which now it makes more sense in the context of the current situation of paying directors as opposed to the previous school of thought of not paying directors for their services. We can see the directors currently have a lot of responsibilities, a lot of duties, and a lot of stuff on their plate to fulfill their job as a director. So it makes sense that you would compensate them for their services. Well, let's talk about the business judgment rule. The business judgment rule when it comes to both officers and directors of the corporation. Basically, it states that if when they've made a decision about something and they go forward with that decision and the decision goes south, it doesn't go well, and a lawsuit is brought, the courts will use the business judgment rule to see whether or not any liability should be imposed upon the officer or the director who had a part in making that decision. And basically, the rule examines it's a three-part analysis. Number one, the courts will check whether or not the person who made the decision took reasonable steps to become informed about that decision. Did they do their homework? Number two, is there a rational basis for them to make the decision that they made? And number three, was there not a conflict of interest involved in making that decision? The Oliveira versus Sugarman case is an excellent example of the business judgment rule, and it is referenced and summarized in your text. You'll want to take a look at that to give you an example of how it operates. But if the person who made the decision, if all the answers to those questions are yes, that they took reasonable steps to become informed, they had a rational basis for their decision, no conflict of interest, even if the decision crashes and burns and it goes sideways, the courts will not hold the person responsible who made that decision because they did all that they are required to do under the business judgment rule. And when you think about it, this makes sense because if the officers and directors did not have this protection under the business judgment rule, who would want to serve in that capacity if there's potential liability against them and they're at risk for making these various types of decisions? So as long as they can establish that, number one, I did my homework. Number two, there was a rational basis for their decision. And number three, there was no conflict of interest, they're going to be protected under the business judgment rule. Very broad protection. Okay, let's move on to the next slide here. Hang on, there we go. Now, so we talked about the duty of care and what that all entails, including the business judgment rule. And now let's talk about the duty of loyalty. And again, very similar to what we dealt with regard to partners and members of an LLC. You have to have a sense of loyalty to the corporation as an officer and a director. You have to put your interests below the interests of the corporation that should be above you. There should be no conflict of interest here. You should be not engaged in any type of self-dealing. You should not be doing something that would compete financially with the corporation. You should not be able to take advantage of a corporate opportunity like buying stock ahead of time or right before a big announcement is made that about the corporation that will make the stock go up. You shouldn't use inside information to your own personal benefit. You should not authorize an action that is detrimental to a minority of the shareholders because, again, you're putting your interests above the interests of the potential shareholders. And any decision to sell over control of the corporation that would go against the corporation's best interest, you shouldn't do that. And anytime there is a conflict of interest, once again, there should be major disclosure made to the other board members and even sometimes to the shareholders to make sure that if there is a conflict, that it is disclosed and that conflict be waived if the director is going to go forward with what their conflict entails. Let's see, next section, talking about liability of directors and officers. Directors and officers can be held liable for crimes committed on behalf of the corporation, and we talked about that, how a corporation can be fined, but that liabilities and directors who engage in illegal activity on behalf of the corporation can be arrested and serve time for their criminal acts that they do on behalf of the corporation, and they can be held responsible for torts or civil lawsuits, specifically torts committed on behalf of the corporation. Now, don't confuse this with the business judgment rule. That pertains to decisions they made regarding what the corporation is going to do, and that standard will be applied. But if I, as a director, are serving as a director during a time that a defective weed whacker is sold and it injures somebody in their garage and the guy's best friend in the garage, and a products liability suit is brought, if I had a hand in making that decision, I could of putting that forward and letting that be placed on the market in its defective condition, I could be named as a party to that lawsuit as well for the products liability lawsuit, along with the corporation manufacturer, and as we talked about in torts, even the distributor, even the Lowe's or the Home Depot can be brought as a defendant. So there can be both criminal liability for officers and directors, as well as liability in tort for officers and directors. Okay. And we're coming up on 10 minutes in this particular segment, and we're looking at the next segment is going to be the roles of shareholders and the duty of shareholders. So this might be a good time to stop this particular segment, and hopefully we'll wrap up the third segment talking about directors in maybe a little bit more than 10 minutes, but we'll conclude it all in that next segment. So that wraps it up for both role and duties of officers and shareholders, and officers and directors, and we'll move on to shareholders. Thanks.